Hello, everyone. Welcome to Airlink's webinar commemorating 1 year of response to the crisis in Ukraine. We're right here at the top of the hour, 11 o'clock Eastern. My name is Stephanie Stagey. I'm our Director of Humanitarian Programs, and I'm excited to talk to you all today about what Airlink has done with respect to the response in Ukraine and where we're headed. So 6 months ago, Airlink hosted another webinar. We heard from NGO partners on the challenges of the response, which were many, and we heard about the humanitarian need, which was then and continues to be significant. Today, however, you're going to be hearing from the Airlink team, a group of women who have worked tirelessly to mobilize responders, aid cargo, and resources for this response, about some of our notable achievements and our plans for the next year of the conflict and the response to it. So today you'll hear from myself, from Ashley Bustillo, who leads our personnel deployment portfolio, Bethany Holland, who leads our cargo portfolio, Cindy Rocha, who leads our strategic partnerships, and in particular our aviation partnerships, and Sandra Walter, our Director of Development. If time allows, we'll take a few questions at the end of the session, so please feel free to enter those into the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to give you some answers at the end. So without further ado, I'll jump right in. So as an international humanitarian nonprofit organization that's focused on providing airlift and logistics services to other NGOs, our concept of operations for this response was pretty immediately clear. So since day one of this response, we've worked to support the humanitarian relief efforts of credible NGOs in need of airlift for their responders and cargo. The goal, of course, has been to coordinate across all of our partners, helping them get access to low-cost air transport, reducing duplication of effort, across the supply chain, and then channeling aviation resources towards priority needs. Our focus has been not only on Ukraine, but also the surrounding countries that have taken in refugees. So in September 2022, we made a formal commitment to action at the Clinton Global Initiative annual meeting to deploy 1,000 tons of aid supplies and 1,000 responders to the region, so supporting a sustained relief effort that can help millions of people. 1 year on, we are really pleased to say we've met our goal with respect to aid supplies, actually back in November, so pretty soon after this commitment was made. And we're well on our way to sending our 1,000th responder for this emergency. In the first year of the conflict, Airlink has launched a massive response. I think we're not alone in saying that. Thanks to steadfast airline support, generous donors, collaborative logistics partners, and a coalition of NGOs that is deeply connected to communities in crisis, we have delivered emergency relief to 5.5 million Ukrainians so far. So what exactly have we done? I've got some numbers for you. At this point, beginning in late February, we mounted a rapid and sustained response to match the scale of the need in Ukraine and, as I said, other surrounding countries. Today, we worked with the aviation community to mobilize nearly 1,300 tons of critical aid supplies and nearly 700 responders for aid agencies and their community partners in Ukraine, Poland, Moldova, Romania, Slovakia, and Hungary. In addition to those hard numbers, we worked to foster collaboration with the NGO community throughout this emergency. In the first couple of months of the response, we coordinated 5 calls that connected 128 participants across 63 nonprofit organizations. And that's something that really often happens behind the scenes, but we really feel this collaboration is important. NGOs share their struggles openly, but they also exchange information on security and safety issues, and they form partnerships to reach more people in more communities. We've continued to make those linkages even without formal coordination calls throughout the response. So we're helping organizations find partners in countries where they're working, and sometimes in countries where they're not working, but they need somebody to send aid to work to ensure that as many people are reached with assistance as possible. Airlink's work bringing together the aviation and broader philanthropic communities to support its NGO network has saved nonprofit organizations nearly $6 million in transportation and logistics costs over the past year, making this, perhaps unsurprisingly, the single largest response in Airlink's history. The programs we've supported with Airlift have provided access to medical and mental health care, shelter, water, sanitation and hygiene services and supplies, food, protection services, and other services for both internally displaced Ukrainians and refugees. For the first time in the response, Airlink is tracking the communities that it is reaching through its nonprofit network. This is often thanks to logistics partners that continue to operate trucking operations deep into the conflict areas, but it's also through the local networks that our implementing NGO partners have. Airlink has helped NGO partners reach more than 170 communities across 6 countries in the region, reaching refugees as far west as Szczecin in Poland and as far east as Luhansk, Ukraine, on the front lines of the conflict. So today we're going to talk about a few particularly special programs. They're all special, but these are just a few that Airlink and its airline partners have donated support for over the last year. And of course, the impact that those programs are having even today. So first, I'd like to hand it over to Ashley Bustillo to talk about a few high impact programs that we've supported with tickets for responders. So Ashley, over to you.
Thank you, Stephanie. So in the first year of this response, like Stephanie mentioned, Airlink has supported more than 600 flights for responders from 30 partner organizations that are responding in the region with several different interventions, including providing healthcare to refugees and IDPs, WASH, rebuilding, and logistical support. Like I mentioned, Airlink supports a wide range of NGOs with a variety of different interventions, and today I'd like to highlight a couple of programs that Airlink has supported in this past year, starting off with Global Response Medicine, who in the first 6 months of this response, Airlink supported more than 88 flights for. That included flights for doctors, nurses, EMTs, and other medical professionals that volunteered with GRM. Healthcare was and still is one of the most needed humanitarian interventions for Ukrainian IDPs and refugees, and GRM responded directly to this need by providing life-saving care and training at the front lines. They also implemented a program that addressed surgical strain in Ukrainian hospitals that were impacted by the proximity to the front lines by increasing operating room capacity and advancing practice techniques. The teams donated more than 10,000 working hours and participated in medical care for more than 700 civilians. They also partnered with the WHO to support the medical evacuation of 79 patients from Ukraine. Next slide, please. I also want to highlight IsraAid's program in Moldova specifically. With the support from Airlink, IsraAid deployed more than 70 emergency response professionals, which total was more than 80 flights. And that included protection experts, doctors, nurses, and logistical specialists to Ukraine and surrounding countries. Specifically in Moldova, IsraAid's program created a safe space for Ukrainian refugees. Their medical staff ran a clinic for refugees to treat anything from diabetes to anxiety, and also provided medication for people that had lost access to the usual medications after the war. Protection specialists and volunteers ran a child-friendly spaces program and created summer schools, as well as trained local NGOs to lay the groundwork for long-term resilience building and integration for refugees in Moldova. And with that, I will turn it back over to you, Stephanie.
Thanks, Ashley. And so before I turn it over to Bethany to talk about some of our cargo programs, I wanted to talk about a special donor and an innovative program that Airlink and its partners carried out during the fall and winter last year. And I think we have a couple of folks from the Buddha Suchi Foundation on the call. So a huge thanks to you. The Buddha Suchi Charitable Foundation worked with Airlink on a really first of its kind program that funded procurement, transportation, and program implementation. So the full supply chain of the response for a coalition of organizations that's focused on access to healthcare for IDPs in Ukraine and refugees in Moldova. So with a $3 million grant, Airlink worked with coalition partners and a few other NGOs who fall within the scope of the grant to reach nearly 500,000 people in Moldova and Ukraine, sending more than 230 tons of supplies and saving those NGOs nearly $800,000 in transportation costs. So the three NGO partners that were part of the coalition formerly, ADRA, Project Hope, and World Hope International, procured supplies from all over Western Europe, the US, Turkey, to name a few places. And then Airlink worked to transport those supplies where they were needed. Those NGOs then had staff in the country who were delivering those programs directly. So ADRA provided 13 hospitals in Kyiv Oblast, Ukraine, with highly needed supplies and durable medical equipment that's going to continue to support those health systems in the long term. Project Hope provided 56 hospitals in Ukraine with highly needed supplies and established 4 mobile medical units, including the actual cars for those mobile medical units to reach people in recently liberated communities in eastern Ukraine. And World Hope International provided rehabilitation equipment to the main hospital that's treating injured and chronically ill Ukrainians seeking refuge in Moldova. They also distributed hygiene kits to those families and provided a 6-month supply of insulin to 85 refugees that are currently receiving care at the hospital. That hospital is now scaling up, seeing about 230 patients every month. And so the impact of those supplies is going to continue to grow. Durable medical supplies are an amazing thing. So with all of that impressive program there, I'd like to turn it over to Bethany Holland to talk about a few other noteworthy projects that we've been working on over the last year.
Thank you, Stephanie. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, you're great.
Great. So as Ashley and Stephanie have already mentioned, after the onset of the current war in Ukraine, the scale of humanitarian needs was huge, and that continues to be true. Airlink's NGO partners have established or strengthened partnerships within the region to identify these needs and have then procured goods to deliver to populations in need, but that requires airlift. With millions of internally displaced persons and refugees in neighboring countries that are experiencing limited access to basic needs, such as food and clean water, reliable sources of aid are necessary. And to support the amount of supplies requiring airlift, Airlink worked to identify solutions to build a steady pipeline of supplies and provide that reliable aid to communities in need of support. We put this into practice, moving cargo on behalf of our partners at Global Medic with the establishment of an air bridge from Canada into Europe, where cargo was then trucked into Ukraine and Moldova. Air Canada Cargo generously allocated space once a week for a total of 23 weeks across 2 air bridges in 2022. With funding support from flexport.org and the Budisuchi Foundation, this multi-partner project moved 126 tons of supplies, reaching 70,000 people. These shipments sent on the air bridges included 15,000 family emergency kits, which contain hygiene items, solar lights, and water filtration systems to families in Ukraine and Moldova. They sent over 5,500 emergency food kits, which contains shelf-stable foods, solar lights, and water purification items to Ukraine, which ultimately reached over 14,000 people with nutrition support. And they also had nearly 2,000 pieces of firefighting equipment. This equipment was distributed to volunteer firefighters operating in areas experiencing continuous bombardment that outsides the resources available to the current rescue teams. So this airbridge coordination required total alignment of involved organizations, ensuring that all documentation, scheduling, cargo pickup, the flight departures, that they all lined up to make each flight happen. Due to the success of this model, Airlink is hoping to launch additional air bridges to provide continued and sustained support for communities as the humanitarian response in Ukraine continues. And now we will talk quickly about winterization as well. If you can go to the next slide. Thank you. And winterization has been a huge part of the humanitarian response within Ukraine. When winter began in Ukraine, 5.9 million people were internally displaced, 7.9 million people had fled the country, and at least 40% of the population required humanitarian assistance. Millions of Ukrainians were and still are living in damaged homes, buildings, or shelters without sufficient protection from winter conditions. All of this was coupled with ongoing attacks on civilian and energy infrastructure, cutting people off from essential services such as electricity, clean water, and heat. The harsh winter conditions were expected to be the worst in recent years, and Airlink's partner network mobilized to ensure that critical needs were met to protect at-risk populations. During these winterization efforts, we've supported a wide range of interventions, sending shipments containing blankets, generators, and warm clothing and winter-appropriate shoes. Our partners, teams on the ground, have also led rebuilding and repair efforts to provide safe housing that could withstand winter conditions after damage from the ongoing conflict. There were a couple of these shipments that required a bit more innovation than most, so I will touch on those very quickly. This includes a massive shipment of about 80,000 pairs of winter-appropriate shoes on behalf of USA for UNHCR. Their team had received a generous donation of shoes, but ran into complications due to the state of the global supply chain last fall. The donated goods totaled about 130 tons and would require significant cargo movement to reach populations in time. If USA for UNHCR moved these goods by ocean freight across at least a dozen shipments, delays in securing shipping containers and additional challenges out of their control meant that the boots would not arrive by the required distribution date. The potential impact of this would have been thousands of civilians in need of winter clothing, entering harsh winter months without adequate footwear. In this circumstance, moving the cargo via airlift was the best option to meet the critical needs of populations in Ukraine. With funding support from the Flexport.org fund, Airlink coordinated 11 flights of boots into the region, which enabled the donation to be distributed by the required date. The boots that arrived were able to cover about 20 to 25% of the identified needs and were distributed to 5 different areas in Ukraine. Similarly, late last year, Airlink received a request to support the movement of 26 generators from India to Ukraine from IFRC. With increased Russian strikes directed at energy infrastructure, generators were of critical need to help families survive sub-freezing temperatures and to also power facilities such as hospitals and clinics. Airlink supported several shipments of generators, but this request from IFRC was unique due to the size of the actual generators, which you can see on the slide. And due to the size of these items, they had to move via freighter aircraft and also required a crane to be loaded onto the aircraft. A lift this large does come with a cost, but with Flexport.org funding for the shipment, Airlink delivered significant cost savings to IFRC, allowing them to utilize their budget to support direct programmatic needs. Really quickly, both of these shipments involved several moving pieces and multiple parties, which required significant coordination from Airlink's team and our partners to ensure that cargo was successfully delivered to those who need it. This is especially urgent given the lens of the winterization response. And with shipments like these, there are several potential failure points, and unique to the Ukraine response, shipments require trucking from Europe into Ukraine due to Ukraine's airspace continued closure. With the airlift for UNHCR, for example, each flight required separate coordination for cargo pickup, delivery to our airline partner, the actual flight into Europe, and then trucking from Vienna into Ukraine. If you imagine having to do this for about 80,000 pairs of boots, it's a pretty big lift. With a strict timeline to deliver the winter boots, so that it could be distributed before harsh conditions started, there really wasn't room for error. For the IFRC shipment, on the other hand, due to their size and the requirements to use cranes to load the generators onto the aircraft, the required time it would take to actually load the generators onto the plane meant that origin coordination had to be precise. Again, involving multiple parties, including the donor or supplier, local transportation provider, our forwarding partners, the airline, the NGOs, and the consignee in Ukraine. This is true for all of the shipments that we coordinate, but these two in particular were especially I guess, innovative to make sure that communities in need received the support that they needed in time before true winter conditions hit. But we wouldn't be able to successfully move these shipments or respond in Ukraine to the magnitude we have without support from our partners. And I believe my colleague Cindy will now touch on that a little bit now.
We're having a bit of technical difficulty, but I'll go ahead and take that, Bethany. So as Bethany mentioned, none of this would happen without partnership. So first, thanks to all of the NGOs that put their trust in us to get their staff, volunteers, and supplies, including really massive generators, where they need to go for this response. The diversity of the organizations that we've worked with on this response has meant that we're collectively able to touch so many more communities than any single organization could alone. Of course, part of this diversity has been our work with Ukrainian diaspora organizations, Razom, Nova Ukraine, Ukrainian National Women's League of America, and many others that are listed on this page as well. These organizations have had their finger on the pulse in terms of the needs of the communities across the region, and even some of the organizations we work with regularly on, donations of medical supplies and pharmaceuticals. They're donating directly to these organizations, and we're moving those shipments on their behalf. So it takes a village to mount a response like this. We're grateful for all of our NGO partners. Of course, as Bethany and Ashley also alluded to, none of this would be possible without strong, steadfast support of the commercial airline community. There were so many ways that the aviation and logistics industry stepped up to respond to this emergency, and they continue to do so even today. In the initial days of the response, airlines like United Airlines, Alaska Airlines, and American Airlines stood up miles donations campaigns and donated miles directly to Airlink to empower rapid deployment of responders. Some of those resources, those banks of miles, are still being used even today, and that's just how many flights and how many miles were donated. On the cargo side, while Airlink initially employed charter flights to mount a rapid response and consolidate lots of shipments to get them there quickly, we were able to transition relatively quickly to utilizing commercial air capacity, often on a donated basis, sometimes on a deeply discounted basis. But we're employing a sort of consistent air bridge-like model to utilizing capacity commitments from a wide variety of carriers, including those listed here: Aeromexico, Air Canada, United Airlines, Amerijet, British Airways, and so on. None of this cargo could make it there without flights, and we're deeply grateful for the support from the aviation community there. But it wasn't just airlines that are doing their part. Airlink has worked with a core group of freight forwarders who've lent their knowledge, everything from how to navigate a T1 customs bond to get things from Western Europe into Ukraine, to how to get a truck into, Eastern Ukraine past Dnipro, Zaporizhia, and eastward. But they're not just donating their knowledge, they're donating their services, and they're even funding shipments where free of charge lift isn't available. So you heard Bethany talk a bit about Flexport, but also Seco Logistics launched their Seco Cares campaign, and together hundreds of thousands of dollars were poured into this response. So special thanks to Flexport, Seco Logistics, Priority Worldwide, and UPS for the support that these companies provided to Airlink and to its NGO partners by air, by truck, to get goods where they're needed. Of course, we'd also be remiss if we didn't talk about the amazing support from our corporate and foundation donors who've made this response possible. So for that, I'll hand the mic to Sandra Walter, our Director of Development.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks, Stephanie. I want to extend on behalf of the entire Airlink team, and in fact, all the NGOs that we've been able to support and the people we've been able to reach as a result of your generosity. Thank you for your support of everything that Airlink does, and in particular, in this conversation, our response to reach the people of Ukraine with aid and help. Specifically, I want to call out and acknowledge a couple of key lead funding partners. Among those on this list, our lead funders, ISTAT and the ISTAT Foundation, Air Lease Corporation, GE Foundation, and Airport Councils International Europe, among many, both industry and foundation and other funding partners, including foundations from across the United States and the world, like the Oregon Trail Community Fund and others. I also want to call out and thank our partners at United Airlines for driving campaigns out to their loyalty members for both miles and for cash support, and reiterate our thanks to American Airlines, which raised from its American Advantage members over 85 million miles to support Airlink and its work, including and especially the work in Ukraine. All of this support has added up to our ability not only to fund the initial year, but to have resources going into the second year to be able to continue the work we do to reach the people of Ukraine and across those who are displaced as well. So thank you all, and thank you each, whether you gave $100,000 or whether you gave $100. Your gifts have been well used. I hope you found through this presentation and through reading and seeing our reports during the course of the year, and will continue to be used. So many people came in through CNN and Fidelity and Schwab and other outreach workplace giving campaigns with about 50 companies that, again, just to underscore, those of you who donated directly and those of you who helped us reach out to others, we really appreciate it. We continue the work on your behalf to reach the people of Ukraine. Additionally, I want to add here, while we do have the resources to support the next year's activity in Ukraine, because of restricted donations, as you know, Airlink responds to 12 to 15 different humanitarian crises and natural disasters at any one point in time across the world. And currently there are three major responses among those. Our response to the cholera outbreak and the health issues in Haiti, where we have an air bridge going, our response to famine and drought in Africa, where we are working on an air bridge to get aid there across multiple countries on the continent. And most recently, the response to the Turkey-Syria earthquakes, which, you know, the numbers are profound, and our response will be as profound as well. We've already sent over 120 responders. We have right now about 1,300 tons of aid in the pipeline, including tents and other key critical aid that's needed to help give people shelter, food, wash, hygiene, medical care. And we hope that you will be as generous and thoughtful for the people of Turkey and Syria as you have been for the people of Ukraine. And we look forward to continuing to brief you on our responses there, and appreciate the support that you'll provide us as well to help those folks. Thanks, Stephanie.
Thanks, Sandra. And so as Sandra alluded to, you know, it can be difficult to predict what comes next in a conflict response, but I think one thing is clear. There's still a need for support from Airlink and its aviation logistics partners, and we are still here responding. Thankfully, we're coming through the winter into spring now. Fewer blankets and generators are going to be needed in the coming months. However, there's still a need for specialized humanitarian aid, from water, hygiene and sanitation to food aid, health and psychosocial services, and that's being provided by organizations that Airlink continues to support today. So while deployments of volunteers and skilled responders have certainly slowed from their peak in mid-2022, we don't see those deployments going away anytime soon. And in fact, many of our partners are now pivoting towards training in-country first responders and medical personnel, and equipping communities with long-term solutions for clean water, power generation, and medical care. And that's going to require continued support. Today, Airlink's working to match 13 shipments of supplies with airlift to Ukraine. And we have 8 shipments actively in the air in transit today. So despite all of the emergencies around the world today, as Sandra outlined, this response continues to be among our busiest. So with all of that said, we're committed to continuing to support programs to assist those displaced in Ukraine and the surrounding countries for as long as airlift is needed. And with that, we've all been very fast talkers today. And I think we have one question in the Q&A box. We'd be happy to answer any of the questions from the audience if we can. So we've got one question here. Do Airlink employees deploy with personnel or cargo during airlift operations to directly facilitate their transport and arrival? So we've made a deliberate decision not to deploy our own employees with cargo and personnel. We do our best work building and fostering relationships and facilitating those cargo movements and movements of personnel from our HQ in DC. By not sending personnel in these kinds of settings, we're making sure that we're not using resources that can be used by refugees or by skilled responders that need that hotel room or that clean water in these sort of rapid onset and long-term programs. We do from time to time deploy when there's a significant logistical constraint or need where we feel we can, bring some clarity, facilitate movement of supplies, but that really only happens in select situations, we'll say, where there is a significant challenge. See. Is there any other questions we can answer from the group?
Stephanie, it's Sandra. Can you talk a little bit, or one of the team members talk about the challenges, what some of the key challenges that you faced in terms of the Ukraine response, and any of those that may also have been lessons learned that you've now applied to current responses like the Turkey-Syria crisis?
Yeah, actually, I think because Bethany has now been working on our Turkey-Syria response, she may be best positioned to talk about how we're applying some of those lessons.
Yeah, happy to. So I think with Ukraine, like I mentioned, with the closed airspace within Ukraine and just the need to pivot and focus on utilizing trucking networks to get aid to where it needs to go. We really built out our capacity for supporting cargo movement that way and kind of getting creative in the airline partners that we're working with, where we're flying cargo into in the region. And then again, like I said, utilizing last mile trucking, maybe from a different country than we would have previously. Stephanie mentioned this, but that took a lot of lessons learned on utilizing our freight forwarding partners as resources to figure out the customs requirements or other regulations needed for that cross-border movement. But I think that absolutely is now something that we are utilizing for the Turkey and Syria earthquake responses. And due to the congestion at airports within Turkey, or the complexity of moving cargo directly into Syria, kind of has opened up our options and made us think a little bit differently about how we can move cargo, like I said, in a little bit of a more unique manner. We are utilizing that sort of movement into countries like Afghanistan, where we're able to utilize different airline partners to get cargo where it needs to go. But I think all in all, just identifying those best practices have been a huge lesson learned.
Yeah. And I think one thing we learned from the response in Ukraine is so many organizations, and they're coming in and responding for the first time in a country. Customs clearance can be one of the biggest hurdles, biggest challenges, and murkiest areas. And so one thing that Airlink has strived to do over the last year is build out those resources around how organizations can work within the customs frameworks of the emergencies where they're working, understand how to navigate the best practices, and then making sure that we're disseminating that information and then helping those organizations, follow those procedures. The T1 customs bond was sort of the hallmark of this response. So organizations bringing supplies in from the US, from Asia, from elsewhere in the world, into Western Europe, didn't want to clear customs twice, once in Germany, for instance, and then once in Ukraine. So everything has to come in under that T1 customs bond and then be trucked all the way into Ukraine. And then you have to notify the Ukrainian customs official that the cargo has arrived, it's being used, it's not being sold for use in Ukraine, and that closes that bond off. And so if you don't, then you end up having to go back and pay taxes in Germany. And that's really important for our NGO partners and making sure that they're, taking advantage of the customs exemptions that are available. That saves NGOs so much time and so much money when they're able to do that. And our partners being able to navigate that thanks to our freight forwarding network, and thanks to the knowledge that's endemic to the team at this point, has been really important to this response, and frankly to the other responses.
Stephanie, it's Sandra again. I have a similar question for Ashley, who manages our responder passenger portfolio. Ashley, so what are some of the challenges that you have when it comes to requests for getting responders in, who are the first folks who go in, that people might be interested in knowing about, and how do you deal with that and overcome it? People are trying to get there quickly.
Yeah, I think it's pretty similar to some of the challenges that we experience with cargo. Just about getting creative. There's a lot of, especially at the beginning, a lot of smaller airports that were pretty congested. In Poland, for example, that it was pretty difficult to find flights for. So it was just about getting creative with airline partners that we were using, finding some partners that we hadn't worked with in the past and now we're working with, and stuff like that. So yeah.
I think in many cases where we had donated resources that could get partners, their responders so far, the important thing was stitching that donated flight together with the flight that could get them there to the place they really needed it, right? So that's sort of the importance of donor dollars in addition to donated miles or donated tickets. You can't always get to the place you need to on one airline. Great. Well, I wanted to thank everybody who was able to join us today. For those who were not able to join us, we've recorded this webinar and it will be available in the next couple of days on our website. Thank you all so much again for your support of Airlink, your partnership, and for continuing to work with us on the wide variety of things we're doing around the world. Thank you so much, and we hope you have a fantastic day.